Hello and welcome. A while ago, I made a video about Path of Exile 2's UI problem. Their latest update had some issues that I felt were important to address, and a lot of people commented that if they were to change the UI in the way I wanted, it would result in them making a boring corporate application. And I wanted to talk about that because I think they made a fundamental mistake in assuming that clarity and creativity are two opposite ends of the spectrum that can never meet. And in fact, games and websites will never have the same UX, and I want to talk about why. Corporations and these shopping apps want the user interaction to be as efficient as possible, versus games want the user to spend as much time interacting as possible. After all, that's the point of a game, is you interact with it. So this minimalist UI we see in apps and on websites and on basically every digital surface outside of a game exists for speed. And for simplicity, I'm going to call this corporate UI or website UI. You know what I'm talking about. It's boxes and lists and grids and boxes. The whole point of it is to reduce the amount of friction in your brain. And the reason why they want to reduce the friction for you is because the less work you have to do to interact with their app, the more money they make. This is why Reddit is trying to trick us into thinking ads are post, and Instagram and TikTok has a sponsor for every video, why every company has a faster checkout option. Because the less you think about it, the less you're gonna say no. Now, games aren't this way, but they do take some things from this user experience. Sometimes they adopt these sterile feeling patterns, and they do that because these patterns are a common visual language. If you think about a drop-down, for example, you know how a drop-down works. No one has to explain it to you. You've seen it in games, you've seen it on websites, you've even seen it on mobile apps when they're like, oh, select the state you live in, and then the whole thing pulls up and you have to select one. The reason why they all use it is because everyone already knows how to use it. You don't have to learn anything new. So for websites, this makes a lot of sense. But for games, why would they not want to use something new and innovative? When a game uses something like a drop-down, it's saying something very specific. It's saying that this thing is not part of the game. It's not important to interact with, and in fact, we want you to interact with it as quickly as possible and move along so that you can actually do the fun stuff. It is just a tool to move you forward. That's why we see it in all of the settings menus, because the settings isn't part of the game, so they shouldn't encourage you to spend more time there. And these common patterns are exactly why a lot of applications from companies look the same. All the banking apps look the same. All the food delivery apps look the same. All of the login pages look the same because people know the established patterns, and it reduces the amount of friction and the amount of effort users need to put in to use the system to operate it. So if reducing friction is really good everywhere else, why does it suck in games? And here there's a fundamental difference between what people want out of their website UI and out of their game UI. People don't want a reinvention of their to-do list app. They want something different. They don't want to feel like they're pulling out their phone in the middle of a game and selecting beep boop, new match. They want it to have charm and personality, and that you want it to feel immersive. You want it to feel like the interface exists within the universe of the game and not your universe, which right now kind of sucks. One example of this immersive UI is in Dead Space, where the health bar is on the back of the character and not some random red rectangle on the side of the screen. That is a perfect and most easily digestible snippet of what it's like to have UI that's built into the world and feels like you are completely engrossed in that universe. The UI should contribute to, or at least not take away from, the story. It should reflect the feeling that we're evoking from the player when you enter the game and you're embodying these characters. One great example of UI is in Path of Exile with their passive tree. It is the most iconic part of the Path of Exile UI. And I know it looks like a jump scare, but I promise you that feeling is actually communicating something. It's communicating to you that this game is vast, and it's complex, and it's deep, and you're meant to take your time to explore it and understand it. It's supposed to feel a little bit overwhelming because it's communicating to you that this game has so much to explore. And what is beautiful about it is that you inherently know how to operate it. When you get a point, you allocate it and you get the next point and you connect it to that point, and it very quickly makes a lot of sense. It's not used in any website or mobile application because it can be overwhelming and it's hard to make accessible. But it does effectively communicate your progress in the game, your character's archetype, future possibilities. This passive tree is shared among players so they know how you're experiencing the game versus them. In fact, the developers of Path of Exile know how good this UI is because they have used these trees in basically every part of the game. In fact, the latest Path of Exile update included a mechanic that made fun of how many trees they had.
You'll find that this tree has a tree. That's right. It couldn't be Path of Exile unless the tree also had a tree.
It was a tree with many trees as a joke because the passive tree is so iconic to them. The reason I'm talking about Path of Exile in this discussion about user interface is because it is one game with many examples of good and bad user interfaces. Path of Exile has seasonal releases, so every couple months we get a new mechanic to explore in the game. Even more than that, the player base for Path of Exile is incredibly invested. There are people who are spending days and weeks figuring it all out. So even if the UI is absolutely unusable, there's still going to be someone out there putting the pieces together and making a guide about it. However, because Path of Exile has these short development cycles for these releases, it means that it's very easy to make something confusing. A lot of people testing these updates already know everything there is to know about the game. In a lot of cases, they already know how the new mechanic is supposed to work. And this is what a lot of people call the curse of knowledge, because it means that if you already understand how the system works and you're presented with a user interface, you're more likely to be able to understand that user interface because you have all this contextual knowledge. But when you put it in the player's hands, they won't have that contextual knowledge, and so they're going to have a harder time understanding the interface than someone with that knowledge. But because these development cycles are so quick, only several months, it means that they don't have enough time to user test or determine where the weak spots are. Oftentimes, they rely on the players' feedback early on to make these UI fixes. And if they're not relying on the initial feedback from players, they're relying on content creators or people who've invested a lot into the game to teach the rest of the player base. Now, they might not intentionally do this where they make something that's not fully finished and then hope that some big YouTuber figures it out and presents it to the public. But a lot of times it comes across this way. A lot of times people are stuck waiting for someone to figure it out and teach them so that they don't have to do the work themselves. And sometimes because these mechanics vary so much in how they work. I mean, they've had everything from city management to hack and slash to roguelites to dungeon building. Sometimes the entire mechanic is UI and we are forced to figure it out. Now, this is completely different from a corporate or a website UI where they never rely on the user to figure it out. They purposefully remove all of that, even going so far as to track how many clicks it takes for me to get to the homepage to the checkout screen. But games don't have that same incentive because part of the game is the discovery. Part of the game is solving this. So they're not incentivized to optimize their user experience. And a lot of times it's okay because the user's already primed or open to resolving this on their own. They're less likely to give up. They're already in a mode where they're thinking, okay, this is a puzzle, I'm going to solve it. Solving the UI is part of the puzzle. And so we've seen both from Path of Exile. We've seen them rely on this like more website-based UI and the more in-game UI. One example of this was in Path of Exile 2, a mechanic called Abyss. Now, Abyss was a great update. Everyone in the player base loved it. And what was great about it is that it relied on the core gameplay, which is slaying monsters. It's the first thing you do when you encounter the mechanic. The other thing Abyss had was a lot of feedback at different stages of the experience. So they had visual effects, they had sound cues, they had quest lines, and lots of like in-game notifications, if you want to call them that, about progression, about things happening. It also introduced some mechanics to get better weapons, to like craft better weapons. A lot of these relied on mechanics that were already in the game, so it basically boiled down to like right-clicking an item and getting a multiple choice quiz. It really was not an involved system at all. So it was kind of special in that it didn't need a blog post or a YouTube video or a spreadsheet to optimize. It was easily digestible by nearly every player because the game mechanics did all the communication. The progression and crafting were all existing patterns within the game, and they just built on top of those. So if we wanted to look at a counter example, let's look at one of the least enjoyed leagues in all of Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. It was in Path of Exile 1, it was called Necropolis. Now, Necropolis was a crafting mechanic based on a grid. Depending on where you placed items within this grid, you'd get different outcomes. Similar to Abyss, they didn't really introduce any new screens or UI mechanics. Besides this one space, there wasn't really much new. So, why was this one hated so much compared to Abyss? Well, what if I told you they had 88 slots for these items in the grid? And keep in mind, their position matters. So you didn't have to collect 88 items, but if you wanted the best outcome, of course you were going to collect 88 of them. And so once you've planted 10 of them, how do you know what's about to happen? Well, you don't really. You just keep placing more items down. Do you know what the outcome is going to be? No, not really. It relied on the existing item mechanic, which means that if you had an entire inventory of items to put in the grid to create this craft, you had to hover over each one and see what their effect would be. They all looked the same in the inventory, and it relied on you to put things in the right spot. Most players used some insane external tool to understand what this should look like because it was just impossible to understand. You really did need the external website to know what to craft. And this Necropolis mechanic had no clarity and no predictability. You didn't really know what was going to happen until you clicked the crafting button. Understanding cause and effect in this league was near impossible, and that's the whole point of the video game. If you kill a monster, you get the loot. If I plant a super expensive corpse in a graveyard to craft an item, will the item be good? Who's to say? Now, Necropolis had several other issues, which is why it is extremely hated, but whenever I talk about UI and UX, people bring Necropolis up as the star-studded example for the worst possible UI in a game. So what makes game UI bad? Game UI is bad when it doesn't deliver all of the necessary information. Obviously, we need a certain amount of information to interact with the game, but sometimes the lack of information and interface is part of the game. It's a game, you're meant to discover it. But if you don't get information to know what you're looking for next, if it doesn't create a sense of discovery or invoke curiosity, then it has completely failed. Because anytime you're not provided with the information you need, it should be because part of the fun is figuring that out. The sense of discovery is what makes a game so good. You think about like the story, the characters, the strategies, the puzzle solving. All of this relies on some missing information, but you need to be encouraged to discover it. And this is where Path of Exile 2's Temple UI really failed for me. The Temple UI is a build your own dungeon sort of situation. You kill enough monsters to be able to place these rooms down in your dungeon, and then once you've placed them down, you can go run your dungeon and get loot. But when I interacted with this for the first time, I had no information and no real understanding on how to get that information, and if you were to try and brute force the information, it was spoon-fed to you in crumbs, so it would take hours and hours and hours to really figure it out. Now, eventually, they added informational displays to show you how your different rooms interacted with each other and to give you a better idea of how to buff the different parts of your dungeon. And for me, this helped a lot to solve the problem. A lot of people actually completely changed their opinion on this mechanic. They hated it for the initial release and eventually became to love it. People started to love it once they felt like they could master the system. Once they felt like their interaction could create a specific outcome, everyone I talked to loved the mechanic. So it's not only delivering the information, creating a sense of curiosity around it, but it's also creating this strong sense of cause and effect. Because like if you press a button in a game, or in any software really, it should do something. Like the button should become darker when you press it. It should make a noise. It should change the screen somehow. It needs to look different once you do something with it. Like, especially in games, interactivity is the point. So cause and effect is absolutely vital. And you want to feel like you have agency in this effect. You want to feel like you're contributing to a positive outcome, to maybe a different outcome that would happen otherwise. Not having this agency just makes you feel helpless and honestly, like even nihilistic, because what's the point of playing the game if you playing it is not going to change the outcome? If that's how the game works, just go watch a movie. The last aspect of a bad game interface is forcing you out of the engaging gameplay to understand how to engage with the game. And this is where website UI actually starts to get useful, because games want to concentrate user attention on a specific part within the game. And if the UI is not part of it, then they should utilize this more like corporatized user interface experience to quicken the introduction, quicken the parts that are not about the gameplay to get to the fun part. And you see this all the time in like inventory management and like first person exploration games, because the inventory management is not the fun part of the game. The fun part of the game is meeting a new villager, defeating the next boss. The fun part is not the inventory. So a lot of times they'll adopt a very simple inventory, a very common inventory system. They'll adopt grids because grids are easier for us to read as humans and to scan through. They'll rely on these systems for the non-gameplay parts of the game. If the player has to spend a significant amount of time outside of the fun part to figure out your interface, then we've lost the plot. And this requires us to have a really good understanding of what you consider the gameplay. The line gets blurry because where does the gameplay start and end versus the UI? A lot of times the UI is the game, and the UI is subjective, so not everyone is gonna agree about what makes sense and what doesn't. Some games, like card games, for example, are entirely made up of UI. If you look at Balatro is entirely interface. It's a great game. And puzzle games have this a lot too. The entire experience is centered around the interface, but you don't always notice because the interface is the game. Those experiences are entirely coupled together. So more often than not, a good card game has a great UI. I'd also probably consider these games to be most similar to a website, but let's talk about where they're different. Because games and websites have completely different goals. Like, you don't need to feel immersed in your DoorDash app to pick up dinner. These mobile applications and websites prioritize communicating to you as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible. Some options that are very, very clear with little to no friction, little work on your part, no flourish, no experimentation, no font difficult to read, just speed, clarity, and to get the job done. I do want to mention accessibility here. I don't want to focus on it, but I do recognize that a lot of websites have better accessibility in games. Not that they should, it's just that accessibility is a lot harder in games because games are so much more complex, they're trying out different mechanics, there's not really any standards involved in accessibility for games, and also games are seen as more optional than websites. Like, the internet is now at a point where everyone has to use it to interact in society, but games you don't have to use to interact in society, even though there should be more accessibility in games. It's just less there. But it's not even just about like understanding the information as quickly as possible. It's also about the motivation behind it, because corporate UIs exist for KPIs and conversion and retention and watch chart go up. They're trying to get you to buy their product with as little effort on your part as possible. Every time they step away from an interface you already know how to use, they are lessening their chance of making money. And so they're not going to experiment with interesting UIs, partially because they don't want you, the user, to have to learn a new UI, but also because they don't want to take the time to build it. Why would you build an entirely new keypad when you could just reuse the one that already exists on the phone? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So they're just less willing to try new things. And people don't even want new things. Like, you wouldn't even want a text field that doesn't work the same way as you'd expect. Then there's also testing it, reviewing it, and honestly, even just agreeing on it. So companies are always going to choose like the fastest and the cheapest option, but games don't really have this limitation. Not because they don't want to be fast and cheap, but because you've already bought it. Like, websites are trying to get you to the checkout screen. When you're playing a game, you've already checked out. You already own the game. You've given them money. Let's pretend microtransactions don't exist, because I know that there's a lot of games trying to get you to buy stuff within their game. I get it. Games can experiment more with interesting UIs that might not get you to your goal as quickly because you've already had the buy-in. And the other side of that is that games are art. Their priority is your experience. They're not trying to get you to do something specific. They're just displaying a perspective or story. Websites are not art. Website UIs exist to get you to look at ads, to sell products, to get engagement, but games don't exist for that reason. They exist to tell stories and create experiences. So games don't really need to deliver information to you as fast as possible, because that's not how their success is measured. That's why games can experiment, and website UI doesn't or can't. But that being said, games still benefit from the clarity of corporate UI. Games aren't trying to get you through the interface, they're trying to keep you inside of it. The moment a game forgets that, it stops feeling like a game. So what games can take from websites is the clarity. What they don't want to take from websites is the urgency. Because games exist to slow us down. They exist to give us a moment to pause and experience some kind of story or activity or moment of fun. Websites exist for metrics and to solve a problem. It's a completely different goal. Do not fret, your game will never look like a website. And if it does, it's probably not a good game. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.